Hi guys, Grand J here, and welcome back to another one of our deck workshop videos. It's been quite some time since we last made one of these, but I've been playing in a lot of regionals recently, so I've been quite busy. So, today I've had a little bit of time to take a break, and yeah, I'm going to show you one of the decks I've been playing at some of the early regionals where I got quite a few top placings again and again. So, today I welcome you to the Water Earth Knights deck, version 4.0. I dub it the Holy Grail. I've been working on this deck for quite some time, making little adjustments, and I feel that this is really sort of the best build I can sort of make for this deck, and it has been showing up quite strongly in my regional play and in my testing. So here we go. So the Holy Grail deck is built around using really consistent search forwards and backups to be able to build up your backups and your forwards very quickly, and to have a really strong board presence. To then use all your combat tricks. And yeah, all your combat tricks from Earth and Water to basically just run over the top of your opponent, and then using a Gipple or another type of forward to just another type of card to really sort of push through for the last bit of damage. This deck is all about setting up really quickly and having a very strong board presence. And the deck's strongest feature is that it's highly consistent and has a lot of very good EX bursts. It's a deck that will set up really quickly and very consistently. There's a lot of search in the deck, so if you're ever finding yourself playing a game where you're just feeling like you're not able to consistently get all the parts that you want, and you wish that you could play something that was about equally as strong but was very, very consistent, that you were able to set up on a very regular basis, then this is the deck for you. So, let's go into the card selection. So, the first card I want to talk about is we got 3 copies of Brandelis. So Brandelis is a forward at 6,000 power, and it costs 5. So definitely that is very, very below the curve. But when Brandelis enters the field, he gets to search your deck for one of his backup buddies, which is either Pelennor or Seguarides. He gets plus 1,000 for each of those that he has on the field. So if you have both Pelennor and a Seguarides, then Brandelis becomes an 8,000 power forward at 5 costs. So on paper, this card doesn't seem like amazingly strong. If you do discount the fact that yes, you do get a card back when you're spending 5, this guy basically costs 3, right? And so if you get the 2 backups, then all of a sudden he's effectively a free cost forward with 8,000 power, which is pretty reasonable. But also when he has the backups in play, he also has First Strike and Brave, and they're both really strong effects to have on a single forward. So this guy is going to be really the bread and butter of this deck. I'll explain more about it a little bit later on, but this card is actually fantastic. The fact that he's also an EX burst is fantastic as well. So if you do hit him off damage, you're able to collect one of the backup parts. So this card is all round, like, it's a card that both fills a support function in your deck, but also is one of your stronger forwards as well. So this card is very good and shouldn't be underrated, even though we've just underrated the hell out of it so far. Next card is Steiner. Steiner, yeah, as you've all known, he is this 5 cost water forward that's FF9. When he comes into play, you can search your deck for an FF9 card. So this FF9 character card, I believe. So again, his base body isn't particularly amazing. He comes at 6,000 power and it costs 5. Again, if you do discounting and consider him a 6,000 power for free, that's a little bit below the curve. Naturally, if you have a FF9 character, then he gets plus 1,000 power, and it's very easy to accomplish this. All you have to put down is just like a FF9 backup, and you're set. So he's a free cost 7,000 power forward. Similar to Brandelis, he's also got an EX burst as well. So this deck, another really amazing feature about the deck is that there's a lot of EX bursts. You can take damage, and you will be gaining resources about 40-45% of the time. So yeah. Also, do note that this card is a knight, so this is what this deck is sort of built around. Usually, in a whole lot of other decks, you're spending 3 or 4 CP to put in a backup that gives certain cards buffs. So, for example, if you're putting Ennard Crow down to give all your Earth guys forwards plus 1,000, or putting Maria down to give all your guys plus 1,000, the core of this deck is to give your knights plus 1,000 power with a 2-cost backup. So that just sort of allows you to set up even faster, and it gives you much more efficiency. So, next card is 2 copies of Garnet. So this is a legendary Garnet, and she's been seeing a lot of play as well. This, unlike a typical water deck, Garnet isn't a huge focus of this deck, but it does give us an extra amount of combat boost. Sometimes that little extra power is really handy. So Garnet is a free cost forward. It allows you to play free cost summons for only 2 water. That's not particularly relevant effect in our deck. But the main value, she has two sort of real main values. So one is she can't be targeted by opponent's summons. So in certain matchups, especially against lightning, being your opponent being unable to use Odin on her is extremely potent. Secondly, she is whenever you cast a summon, it gives all your forwards plus 1,000 power. And in this deck, there are quite a lot of offensive summons. So being able to add an extra 1,000 on top of your combat pumps is generally like a big swing. It just gives you the extra edge that you need. Next card is Zidane. So we have 2 copies of Starter Zidane. So this card, no one is going to argue that this card is bad. This card is actually very good, very versatile. It's a free cost forward that at 7,000 power, so it's exactly where you need to be. It costs 2, or it costs 1 less if you have a FF9 forward, which in this case will be Steiner or Garnet. It's usually a pretty easy threshold to meet, and even if you do have to play him for free, it's not even that bad as well. He has he has 3 different abilities that you can choose on when he enters play, which is to either draw a card, make your opponent discard a card, or to reactivate all your FF9 characters. All of these 3 effects are very relevant. Most of the time, you'll be drawing a card or forcing your opponent to discard a card, but there are relevant times where reactivating your forwards is actually quite good as well. The fact that he is light means that you don't have any sort of color requirements to play him, so if there is an extra card in your hand, irrespective of what color it is, you'll be able to discard to play Zidane. But Zidane is just kind of a free character that you can put down and gives you an extra body on board and allows you to just sort of like to contest the field a little bit better. And so, next we have 3 copies of Deleter Legend. So Deleter Legend hasn't been as amazing or as overpowered as everyone sort of hyped it up to be, but this card has had its relevant uses. So Deleter is a 5-cost forward with 9,000 power, so it's standard, and whenever he's chosen by a character or forward ability, breaks that character or forward, and if he's chosen by a summon, your opponent takes 1 damage. So that is quite a strong ability. It's very similar to sort of like Kuja from Opus 1. What this card really does is that it really just kind of narrows down the options your opponent has to deal with this card. So this card is still vulnerable to, say, the Alcid combo, but it's a significantly worse trade-off for your opponent in that if they try to use Alcid Onion Knight, they will not only have to pay the 4 CP to play the Alcid, but they also lose the Alcid and the Onion Knight. So it basically forces your opponent into either using their typical solutions and losing significantly more, or it forces your opponent to just like find alternative ways to deal with him. So this card's main value is that he's a really strong forward, and he's a really strong forward, and forces your opponent to play around him. And yeah, typically his main weakness is the fact that he doesn't really have anything in combat, but that's okay because this deck sort of hedges a lot of his issues in combat. We're running 3 copies of him, and I'll explain a little bit why afterwards. So we're also running 3 copies of Deleter R. So Deleter R is a 3-cost forward that has 9,000 power, so it's significantly above the curve. His drawback is that when he enters the field, he has to break one of your own characters. Typically, in this deck, we'll be using it to break Raubahn, because Raubahn is a fantastic backup and allows us to replay him. And Deleter also has a handy S ability for just 1 Earth and S. You are able to destroy a forward that's blocking him. So it means that Deleter is a very strong attacker. He's got a very strong body, and it allows us to reuse certain backups. So it's a fantastic ability. I'll be going into a little bit more depth in terms of like when to play each Deleter, but we're running 3 and 3 Deleters just so we have the option to use his S ability, which is an ability that hasn't really seen a lot of play recently, but is actually very potent. Next, we have 2 copies of Gipol. So if you are a Golbez player, you would have seen a lot of Gipol. So Gipol is a 4-cost 8,000 power forward, which is pretty standard, and when he enters play, he increases the power of all your forwards by 4,000. So the value of Gipol really is when you're in this deck at least is really when you have a field of say 2 or 3 forwards, and your opponent is sort of low on life. It's very easy for a deck to sort of slip their highest attacker through their opponent's defenses. Because it's just stronger than their opponent's blockers. But it becomes really difficult to try to force through the last 1 or 2 damage because your biggest guy might be bigger than their biggest guy, but all your sort of mid-range 8,000 power forwards can't get over their biggest guy. So it's very difficult to sort of close the game out. And Gipol is basically the card that allows you to close games out. Basically in a situation where where the game is sort of when your opponent's built up a bit of a defense, and your opponent's sitting at around 5 life, then you can play a Gippo down, all you guys become significantly stronger, and all of a sudden your opponent has to deal with all your forwards attacking in for that turn. So in this case, playing this at the critical time will either close out games or basically just destroy your opponent's board. So this card is very strong, but we don't want to see it too early. That's why we're running 2 copies of it. And the following six forwards are kind of just like different tech pieces that I found and it's used to sort of counter the metagame. They don't form like the core part of your strategy, but they sort of really hard counter a very different parts of the metagame which are relevant. So next card we have is Cecil R from Opus 1. So this is a card I feel that is unbelievably underrated by so many people. So he's an 8,000 power forward at 5 cost, so he's below the curve. His ability is whenever if your opponent uses an ability or a summon, they have to choose Cecil if they can. So most people consider him a lightning rod in the sense that like all your opponent's offensive abilities have to target him. So if your opponent has offensive debuffs or offensive nukes, these things all have to target Cecil. But the main value of Cecil is that he prevents your opponent from targeting themselves with their buffs. So good examples are, so against Earth matchup, this card is extremely potent because there are 2 cards that make it extremely difficult for you to fight Earth forwards. So one is Monk, so it's a backup that's usually always active and it's able to give a forward either +2 or +3,000 depending on which variant they're running, and as well as Golem, which is just offensive 2,000 or defensive 4,000. So while Cecil's on the field, your opponent is locked out from being able to use monks or golems because they have to target Cecil. It shuts down nearly all of their offensive like combat tricks. Cecil is really handy for that. In addition, it's also got a like niche use against fire in that it can draw nukes to him. But the biggest advantage is that if your opponent is running Belias, and most fire decks are running Belias the Gigas, then they have to target Cecil. It's fantastic in that regard. So you never really have to play afraid of your opponent getting +1,000 first strike. Also on a side note, it also just like as a handy little side thing, it also protects your guys from EX burst. So if your opponent flips over a certain EX burst, such as say Raban or Belias, they have to target Cecil. In the case of Belias the Gigas, if they want to draw that card, they have to give your Cecil haste and first strike. So it puts your opponent in a tough situation where if they want to draw the card, they're probably going to have to receive another damage. In addition, Cecil is great in that unblockable ability, effects that make forwards unable to block, or effects that dull and freeze guys must target Cecil. So often a lot of times he's just going to sit there and just soak up all the debuffs and prevent your debuffs from prevent your opponent's debuffs from hitting your other guys. So this card's a fantastic card. In any sort of meta where there's a lot of Earth, I would highly recommend this card. Next card is 2 copies of Guy, and there really is no sort of there's really not much justification you need for playing Guy. Guy basically hard counters Ice. Ice is fundamentally all about discarding cards and dulling and freezing. And for a guy that's both A, brave, and B, unable to be dull by your opponent's effects, he is going to be the biggest hurdle that every Ice deck is going to have to deal with when they're playing against an Earth deck. This guy, like, even if you don't necessarily have to attack him because maybe you can't get over your opponent's guys, he's just a very solid blocker. To quote a friend of mine who played a couple of guys who also topped the regional, he said, when you play Guy against Ice, you can just feel very, very safe. If you combo your guy with a Golem or a Titan, then that guy is just going to sit there and just protect you from all the small Ice forwards. No questions about it. He is very strong in the Ice matchup. In other matchups where he's not particularly relevant, you can just discard him to play other cards. And finally, the last card to sort of round out the forwards is 2 copies of Ash. So Ash is one of the few cards that has 3 distinct abilities, and they're all very good. So the first ability of Ash is that whenever she's targeted by an ability or summon, she gets plus 3,000 power. So this makes her very difficult to deal with for a lot of cards. So most cards that sort of ping for damage, or most cards that do like sort of partial debuffs, Ash is highly resistant to them. By herself, Ash is immune to Alcid Onionite or Alcid Rigdia combo because she's able to buff herself above the damage threshold. So yeah, she's quite good. I typically use her as an early forward against lightning matchups, where if you haven't got Minwu out, then you're always sort of setting yourself up to get wrecked by acid combo. And yeah, so if you don't have Mimimu out, you can play her out early, and she'll generally be very safe. Worst case scenario, your opponent uses an Odin on her, in which case you've come out ahead anyways in terms of like CP value. Additionally, she has other values in the sense that so she's also got the ability to pay 2 water to reactivate herself. So again, in certain lightning matchups and in ice matchups, this ability is very handy. Being able to just reactivate is very strong. It forces your opponent's snows to have to play very defensively. So typically snow can just like can dull a guy when he attacks, but if you just have the ability to always pay 2 blue, you can reactivate Ashe any number of times and just block. So she's very strong in that regard. And finally, she's also got an S ability, which gives her plus 2,000 power and first strike. So this is just a handy little bonus. Typically, you won't be using her. Yeah, we're not running free copies of her, and we're not really using her for this ability. But on the very rare occasion where you want to block an attack of a forward and you want to be able to win combat, this is just like a handy little extra thing that your opponent has to worry about. So definitely, those last 3 cards really sort of help you deal with different decks in the metagame. Yeah, I kind of feel that Ice is quite strong, so that's why I went 2 Guy and 2 Ashe. So yeah, on to the backups. So this deck's running 17 backups. The first backup we'll talk about is free copies of Ophelia. So Ophelia is a 2-cost water backup that gives all your knights plus 1,000 power. So it's one of the few 2-cost backups that give your a board wide buff and doesn't really have a drawback compared to say Pelennor. Compared to say I forget. Compared to the Sky Pirates buff, she's able to give all your knights plus 1,000 power all the time. So this card is very cost efficient for what it does. This deck runs quite a few knights, and they're quite strong, and being able to just constantly give them plus 1,000 is very good for only a 2-cost backup. You can play this card early, and yeah, her effect will always be relevant nearly all the time. She's basically the equivalent of what 2-cost water Yuna is in Riku Yuna Pain decks. You put it down early, she's very cost efficient, you get that first 2-cost backup down, and her effect is always going to be relevant. Next card, we have 2 copies of Pelennor. So we have 2 copies of Pelennor and 2 copies of Segwarides. I suppose I'll talk about these at the same time. So they're both 2-cost backups, and they're Earth. And they're the backups that you search for when you play Brandelis. So, first of all, the main function is to give your Brandelis plus 1,000 for each one of these guys that you can have. So, basically gives your Brandelis plus 2,000 power. The fact that Brandelis can search for them is also really handy. It means that early on, if you don't have these cards, you can search for extra copies. Later in the game, when you're playing Brandelis, you can get extra copies for free. Even if you're not using them, you can just use them to discard. So they have 2 different. They both have their own separate abilities as well. So Pelennor is a 2-cost backup that gives your Brandelis first strike, and also has an ability where you can pay an Earth, a colorless, and dull it to deal 1,000 damage to all forwards. So a couple little things about this. So giving your Brandelis first strike is really strong. The way I see it, first strike is actually underrated in a lot of cases. In a lot of cases, first strike basically means another plus 1,000. Basically, it means that in a situation where both your powers are equal, first strike will allow you to basically be 1,000 ahead, or basically be able to outfight your opponent. Not only that, when your Brandelis has Ophelia, Pelennor, and Segwarides out on the field, which happens quite a lot, he's at 9,000 power and he's a brave, but you can also use this guy to deal 1,000 damage to your opponent's forwards, which means that effectively your Brandelis can first strike 10,000 powers and higher, 10,000 power forwards. So, not only that, it's also handy as just a way to sneak an extra 1,000 damage onto forward. So, if you got the backups open, and let's say if you're blocking with Zidane against an 8,000 power forward, then later in the turn, you can just use Pelennor to spread 1,000 damage to your opponent's forwards, and basically deal lethal damage to them. So this card is actually underrated in terms of its secondary uses. So both the backups for Brandelis, I used to buff Brandelis, but a lot of people write them off because they have very relevant abilities in their own case as well. And in this case, Pellennor's got a secondary ability. For Segwarides, this card is also highly relevant. In some cases, this is probably more relevant. Actually, sorry, I think I made a mistake. Pelennor removes first strike. So Pellennor's second ability for just a dull, he removes first strike on a forward. So this is actually highly relevant in quite a few matchups as well. You'd be surprised at the few situations where you are dealing with forwards with first strike. Typically, typically it's most relevant against fire. So there'll be times where your opponent will try to use first strike to deal with your forwards through using Ballistic Gigas, and being able to just remove your opponent's first strike is really handy. Occasionally it is useful against ice, where there's a couple of abilities that can sort of give their guys first strike. So being able to just dull forward and being able to reactively remove first strike is actually really handy. Oftentimes it will catch your opponent off guard simply because they don't remember the fact that you can basically remove first strike. Segorides is the 2-cost backup that gives your Brandilis Brave and has, as we said, the 1000 damage spread ability. So giving your Brandilis Brave and first strike is extremely good. Basically, it means that he is an offensive powerhouse. He will just basically be attacking every turn. There's really no downsides to attacking Brandilis. He's 9,000. He's able to fight 10,000, and he's got Brave and first strike. So, yeah. So being able to give him Brave is fantastic. You're able to attack through, and generally against other mid-rangey sort of decks, he'll be able to like outfight them, and then he's ready, or he's active on defense, so he'll be able to defend you also with a 9,000 power body. So yeah, both these cards are underratedly good, but they're also just kind of a 2-cost backup. So that's kind of the value of this deck, in that you can set up strong forwards. They search for your other backups, and basically allows you to set up both a good resource system as well as have the buffs to sort of push your forwards further. So next card is 3 copies of Railbarn. So Railbarn is undisputably probably the first or second best Earth backup in the game at the moment. Probably like equivalent, contesting it with Shantoto. So Railbarn is, it's 4-cost backup that when it comes in, it basically allows one of your forwards to deal their battle damage to one of your opponent's forwards. Generally, this is generally strongest in Earth, simply because Earth has the strongest size forwards, and in a lot of cases, this Railbarn is basically used as a 4-cost removal, and also comes in as a backup. It's also an EX burst as well, which is absolutely fantastic. So if your opponent does hit this off damage, then in a lot of cases you're killing one of their guys, and your opponent cannot respond to it. So 3 copies. Even though like in a game you might play it once or twice, maxing out at 3 copies does hedge against some of the deck's bad matchups, and also if you hit it off an EX burst, it's just fantastic. It's just fantastic. We're running 3 copies of the Leader R, so it means that we can break Railbarns and then replay them later. Next are sort of like the sort of option select sort of backups for the deck. So we have 2 copies of Minwu. So Minwu is, I do not understand why this isn't being played more. It just sort of removes the tools of a lot of decks to sort of deal with you. So Minwu, everyone knows about it. Basically means that any sort of damage that's dealt to your forwards that's less than their power is ignored. This is especially handy against fire and lightning. So those decks have a lot of ways to deal little packets of damage to you, to build up and kill your guys. Against lightning is extremely good because it's able to stop Ousted Onion Knight combo, and that's a combo that's played in almost all lightning decks. So being able to just remove that set of tools from lightning is extremely good. It's also handy against wind, because wind also has quite a few abilities to sort of just like deal packets of damage as well. And so it's in any sort of wind, lightning, or fire matchup, a Minwu is going to be coming down pretty soon, and he's just going to be able to lock up a lot of your opponent's options. Next is 2 copies of Yuna H. And I really like Yuna H in that it hedges against a lot of matchups. This deck really sort of works on just locking a lot of, having tools against a lot of the metagame. So Yuna H has 2 functions. One, she's a 5-cost backup that comes in and returns an opponent's forward back to their hand, or actually just returns any forward back to their owner's hand. So that by itself is okay. It's a little bit costly to do it. She's an EX burst, so there'll be plenty of times where you just hit her off an EX burst and you can slow down or bounce your opponent's aggression. And it's almost always good to just bounce one of your opponents forward using Yuna. But her main value is the fact that she's got an ongoing ability in that when a forward is sent to the break zone, you can remove it from the game. So basically any sort of enter break zone abilities, she's able to just completely stop them. And there's a lot of cards in a lot of different colors that can be hindered by this. So good examples are, for fire, you've now got you've got Emperor Zand, which is like being able to stop him from dealing that 9,000 damage. Revenge is really good, but also quite a few decks are playing Zac. So when Zac enters the break zone, then he searches for a 4-cost cloud and puts him into play. being able to stop that effect is absolutely fantastic. You basically remove a large majority of Zack's value instantly there. Against Ice, being able to stop Renoa is extremely good. Renoa forces a lot of decks to play in a very awkward way, and being able to just say, nope, your Renoa's effect is null and void is just absolutely fantastic. It takes a huge tool away from Ice decks. Against quite a lot of other decks, it's really good. Against Earth, especially if your opponent is playing the Zombie Tactics, Prish and Scarmiglione deck, being able to remove your opponent's forwards basically means they don't trigger off their zombie effect. So, it's handy in so many matchups. I do not understand why this card isn't being played more. It's a fantastic card. So, yeah. So in any of those matchups where it is useful, you just put it down. Next card is just one copy of a 2-cost Scholar. So this Scholar is basically just kind of another backup to just sort of hedge up our 2-cost backup line. And I decided to go with Scholar because this deck does tend to run through its resources quite quickly. So there'll be times where you've set up, like, say, your Pelamon Seguridis combo, and maybe you've lost one Brandelis to damage, so you've only got 2 copies of him. Sometimes your opponent will have some sort of way to remove them, or to remove your cards, and because we're not running a huge redundant copies of all these cards, sometimes using the Scholar to just bounce to bounce your cards in response to allow you to play them again is really handy. Basically just gives you an extra copy for any card. Typically this will be used for like your bigger forwards if you want to keep an extra copy of them, but you can use them again. You can use it for 2-cost Light Sedan, and that's just like kind of a handy effect, because sometimes you put your opponent in a tight situation where you feel that you can close out the game if you make them discard, or you feel that you can close out the game if you can reactivate your backups. Using Scholar to put Zidane back into hand is really handy. Also bouncing Gipol is fantastic. You can basically play Gipol down, swing with a whole bunch of guys, and your opponent is like probably at around 5 life. Next turn, if you want to do it again, you just Scholar him, put him back to hand, and play Gipol down. Your opponent has to actually block your forwards this time. So there's a lot of cards in which Scholar is fantastic. Just playing Cecil down, it's actually not too terrible as well, because if there's a situation where you put a Cecil down and the opponent finally has an answer to him, you just say, nope, use Scholar, put Cecil back to hand, and then put him down a little bit later. This deck, next card, we're running 1 copy of Ico. So, I would have liked to put more copies of Ico, but both the deck and backup spaces have limitations. So, Ico is a 3-cost backup. It searches for a FF9 character. One good advantage of this card is that it's searchable using Steiner. So there's a couple of different ways to go with Steiner. So typically Steiner will be used to search for a Zidane, and then you can play Zidane. But sometimes if you're low on backups, if you're say 2 backups and you want to get the extra backup, using Steiner to search for Ico allows you to basically put a very cheap backup into play, and then the Ico will allow you to search for Zidane or the Garnet that you're looking for anyways. So it's just an extra card. Also, it's handy in certain situations where your opponent has a lot of reactive play, where maybe if you attack with a Steiner, they might use an ability to destroy a Garnet or destroy a Zidane and basically reduce Steiner's power. Having an Ico sitting there in the backup line basically just keeps Steiner up at that 7,000 power constantly. Also, just like worst case scenario, if you ever need to get rid of her to make space for your backups, and you've always got plenty of copies of Deleter R that you can just sort of break her with, which is handy if you need to play a Deleter to contest the board. These are the backups that you want to break. And finally, to round out the backups, we have 1 copy of Shantoto. I didn't play Shantoto in this deck for a long, long time because of the belief that if you just don't lose board, why will you ever need Shantoto, right? But then there are some times where I found that it would have taken a lot of effort to either bait your opponent into bad situations, or a lot of effort to remove all your opponent's stuff, that in some of those cases, you were just better off ditching the board, chucking a Shantoto, clearing things out, and just starting again. And 1 copy of Shantoto, depending on your local metagame, you might bump that up to 2. But Shantoto is just fantastic. You know, if there's a situation where your opponent commits heavily to the board to try to deal with you, and you've all of a sudden lost control of the board, then you just say, all right, we wipe it clean, we go Shantoto, we're done, we start again. No one's really going to argue that this card's bad. It's a very strong card. And finally, onto the summons. We run 3 copies of Golem, which is absolutely fantastic card. So this is a deck that sort of, all you guys are slightly stronger than average, because most of you guys will be sitting around usually at the 8 or 9,000 power mark. So that's stronger than sort of 8s and 7s, but it isn't sort of big enough to get to deal with like the 9 and 10,000. So having Golem is really good. If you use it offensively, that's fine. But Golem's greatest strength is when it's used on defense. So when your opponent is attacking you with say a 9,000, 10,000 power forward, then you just put a Zidane in the way and you put Golem on him. Worst case scenario, your opponent will use some sort of combat trick to sort of counter your Golem, but a plus 4,000 boost is a huge boost. In a lot of cases, you're going to straight up win the fight unless your opponent is already at like a huge combat advantage already. So Golem is extremely good. This deck is really all about sort of winning fights, getting guys quick and using your like very cheap and cost efficient summons to basically just win fights outright. Next, we have 2 copies of True Lane the Impure. So I was running 3 copies in this deck earlier, but I sort of made one change. With 2 copies of True Lane, it's fine. It's also reasonably cost efficient. What I do want to note is that Golems are mostly for defense, but True Lanes are mostly for offense. It's significantly better on offense simply because your opponent will usually have a lot of backups dull when you're attacking into him, and your opponent won't have that many backups dull when they're attacking into you. So True Lane is, in a lot of cases, it'll give your opponent like -3 or -4, which is a huge swing. It's like the equivalent of Golem, and it draws you a card as well. It's definitely more costly, but being able to cycle through more of your deck is absolutely fantastic. The difference between a 2-cost summon that does the same thing and a 4-cost summon that draws you a card. The 4-cost summon, you can't play it as often, but being able to cycle the extra card when you have the extra backups open is actually really handy. It just draws you more options. And it makes it so difficult for your opponent to block you. There will be times where you're just attacking with 7,000 powers a aim, and your opponent might have an 8,000, 9,000 to block you, and they just won't block you because they're afraid that they might get like True Laned. So basically this deck wins because your opponent is afraid to fight you every single time. And not to mention, with Garnet out, this basically gives you another 1k pump as well. And we have 3 copies of Atomos. So Atomos is, so it's basically the summon equivalent of Raban. There's a couple of sort of niche differences to it though. So the first one is that Atomos isn't an EX burst. If it was, then it'd probably be too strong. The fact that you can deal damage with 4-cost summon is basically makes this the Earth equivalent of Odin. There are like pros and cons to it, but in a lot of cases you just treat it like an Odin. You use it to remove your opponent's key forwards from the game, or you use it to sort of get out of bad combat situations. So another niche thing to note is that this card doesn't choose your own forward, in the sense that Raban, you choose the opponent's forward and you choose your own forward, and your chosen forward deals that damage. But Atomos actually deals damage to the opposing forward equal to your highest forward's power. So your opponent can't use a piece of removal to destroy your highest power guy to stop the effect. It will just default to your second highest guy's effect, or second highest guy's power. So in a lot of cases, you'll have generally enough power to lethal their guy out. And another little handy thing is that when you play this with Garnet's 1k buff resolves before Atomos does. So there will be situations where your biggest guy will be big enough to Atomos out their forward, but Garnet's ability will also get your second biggest guy also to that threshold as well, so your opponent isn't able to remove your big guy to prevent the damage being dealt to your opponent's forward. So it's a really strong card. Most of the time, you'll be using it for when combat gets really bad. So in a situation where you may attack with a forward and your opponent uses a combat trick, then all of a sudden you just respond to the combat trick with Atomos. So it's kind of your get out of jail free card in that regard. Also has great synergy with golems as well. So in a situation where your opponent might have 2 particularly strong guys, you can block one of their guys, use golem on your guy to get your guy over the edge, get your guy to like 12, 13,000 power. All of a sudden, the second guy that doesn't want to attack anymore because they can't get over him, then you just combo Atomos because your guy's really big, and then he can Atomos the other big guy as well. So this card's actually very flexible and very good. I don't know, I feel that we underrated him a little bit when he first came out, but he's very good. Basically, Earth really needed an offensive summon, a summon that they can play at instant speed, that's going to remove it forward, and this is what sort of Earth has. And finally, 1 copy of Zodiac. So this card was actually something that I was a little tossing up upon a little bit, but actually in testing has actually been quite good. So this deck tends, unless you're playing against a very fast rush deck, your deck will generally be outracing your opponent for damage. You get guys down faster, you build up faster, and in a lot of cases, your opponent doesn't want to block you. In the situation where you have gotten a damage advantage over your opponent, and your opponent has sort of built up a bit of a wall to try to stop you, Zodiac is what you need to break the stalemate. So he acts as a very similar function to Gipol, but instead of just making you guys bigger so you guys can outfight your opponent's guys, just straight up destroying your opponent's forwards is what this card's all about. So there'll be times where you've got like 3 or 4 guys that are maybe around the 8,000, 9,000 power mark, but your opponent's got one or two particular big guys that are like 10 or 11,000. And you can't get through it, you can't get through it efficiently or quickly. You just cast a Zodiac, take 3 damage. You're usually only like 2 to 3 damage, like normally. And then, this basically allows you to clear out your opponent's entire board, and then you send the rest of them in. The fact that you also have Yuna H means that you don't have to be afraid, and that when you cast this, if you have Yuna on the field, you're not going to worry about enter break zone abilities because you remove them all from the game, and then you just send the rest of your guys in. So this card's actually been quite good. Against aggressive matchups, this is pretty bad, but this deck handles aggressive matchups better than it handles sort of like hard late game control sort of matchups. And this just sort of hedges you up. In situations where, in metas where you are seeing a lot more aggression, then you basically just exchange this for a Shantoto. Or for a second Shantoto. So those are all the cards. So now to talk about sort of general instructions of how to play the deck. This deck is like quite expensive when you start up, like in terms of like putting cards down, but actually, but it then has a really good sort of economy after you get to about 3 backups. So typically you want to go first in this game. So you want to try to go first in this game, but going second actually isn't terrible. There's been quite a few times where I've gone second, and I almost feel it might be about as good, if not better. So I'm still a little bit tossing up whether going first or second is a major issue. Both are fine. So your ideal hand is you want to have an Ophelia, or a Segurides or a Pelennor. So one of the 2-cost backups plus either a Steiner or Brandelis. The reason is that we want to get a 2-cost backup in play in order to play all our odd-costed cards more efficiently. This deck has quite a few odd-costed cards, so getting that first backup is extremely relevant in order to not lose a lot of efficiency throughout the game. So so ideal hand is Ophelia, Segurides, or Pelennor, and a Steiner / Brandelis. Your typical if your sort of the next sort of preferential hand is double 2-cost backups is also pretty solid as well. Obviously it's best if you have both a water 2-cost backup and an earth 2-cost backup. That's also a pretty good situation as well. It means you can put 2 backups down on your first turn, so that's pretty good. In the worst case scenario, if you have a 2-cost backup in hand, probably still keep the hand. Because this deck doesn't run a huge amount of 2-cost backups, and if you don't get that first 2-cost backup, this deck can actually kind of get wrecked pretty hard, just because there is a very small chance that you'll just get a whole bunch of 5-cost cards in your next hand, in your mulligan hand. So generally, don't gamble on it. Keep the 2-cost backup, and you can ramp from there. So all you need to get is that first backup down, and then the deck will sort of do a lot of the work from there on out. For all other hands, just basically pitch them away. So those are sort of your mulligan conditions. So in terms of playing the deck, almost always your first turn is going to be just put down a 2-cost backup and pass in 90% of situations. I found that this is actually like probably the best way to go. So your ideal second turn is to get down a Brandelis or a Steiner. In those cases, you're going to have to tap your backup, and you're going to have to discard 2 cards. So playing a lot of stuff turn 1 means that you're much more limited in terms of the cards that you can discard on your second turn. So your ideal turn 1 is to get an Ophelia or a Segurides or Pelennor down on your first turn. Just discard a card and put it down, and you're done. So that will leave you with either 4 cards or 5 cards in your hand, depending on whether you went first or second. Your second turn is where you sort of like really sort of switch it on. So your second turn is you tap the 1 backup you have, and you discard 2 cards for either Steiner or Brandelis. They'll search for another piece of your combo, and then you try to put it down. So in the case of Steiner, depending on your backups, you'll either search for Iker or you'll either search for Zidane. In a situation in a matchup where your opponent's more aggressive, then I'll probably go for Zidane. If your opponent is a more sort of mid-range control deck, then I'll get Ico, which you can then play next turn. For Brandelis, search for one of his backups. I typically search for the Brave one, which is Seberides. I typically go for that one in more aggressive decks, and in decks or against more aggressive matchups, and against matchups where you feel your opponent might have more combat tricks, I go Pelennor. So basically, in a situation where I feel that my opponent can combat me, I'll get the first strike one because it's basically an extra plus 1k to your Brandelis. Or in a situation where your opponent's trying to rush you with smaller guys, then getting the Brave guy is better because it means you can attack as well as defend. So, and if you go for the Brandelis opening, you'll probably then discard a card and put that second backup down, which will leave you with a 8,000 power Brandelis usually, which is pretty good, and 2 backups. So yeah, and then you just sort of play out from there. So, and then from there on out, you just sort of like try to build up to 3 backups. You want to get that core 3 backups going. You want to get Ophelia, Segurides, and Pelennor, and the deck sort of just ramps up from there. You've got your knights are generally really strong, so you'll be able to contest the board on a purely numbers basis very, very well. And then basically the rest of the deck just either searches you cards or draws you cards. In general, you'll be trying to attack every turn. You want to really put your opponent on the back foot and try to respond to your forwards. Your forwards are really all about getting good advantage and being able to attack through. So you want to be constantly attacking. Because this deck runs 3 golems and 2 choo-choo lane. Especially if you have Garnet out, then there's a lot of times where you'll just be able to attack very, very safely. It's very difficult for your opponent to try to deal with you combat-wise. They will generally be very, very afraid to attack you just because of the golem threat. And after your opponent's made the mistakes of trying to block your attacks and you choo-choo them, then they're going to be very, very hesitant. I found that in a best of 3, if my opponent doesn't really know the deck, the first game will be hugely in your favor, simply because your opponent will try to block you with similar or slightly stronger forwards, and then you just use your combat tricks and win their fight. You gain a huge amount of advantage whenever you win a combat fight. You gain a huge amount of advantage because not only do you because whenever you fight them, and then if you use a combat buff to like make their guy smaller, it's usually much cheaper to use a combat pump than to lose a forward. So for you to spend like 2 or 3 resources to deal with your opponent's big forward, it's generally going to be in your advantage. Plus you keep your forward on the field and they've lost their forward. So you're gaining a huge amount of advantage if your opponent tries to block you. If your opponent doesn't try to block you, you're getting a huge life lead. And like I said, as soon as you get your opponent to around 5 or 6 life damage mark, then all of a sudden Gippo just wins you the game. So yeah, that's really the sort of goal of the deck. So your 3 core backups will be Ophelia, Segurides, and Pelennor. Your two other backup slots will be what I call your flex slots. So usually you have 1 slot open for either Raban or Shantoto. So basically, so if you need Raban, and you'll generally need Raban at some point, he's just such a good tempo play. At some point you're going to play Raban, it's great, you kill one of their guys and then you attack through with the rest of your guys. In certain matchups where you need Minwoo or Yuna, you want to keep Space It Out open. So for any sort of like big enter break zone abilities, you put Yuna down, which is like also a big tempo play as well, because you tap 3, put Yuna down, you bounce one of your opponent's guys, so that will generally allow you to rush in with all your guys as well. Against Minwoo, you put it down, it's a cheap backup, and it locks out a lot of like lightning and fire stuff. Generally, you don't want to go up to 5 backups unless you've got a deleter to clear out some of your backup line. That's kind of the weakness of this deck, is that there's not a lot of backup slots. So you can't just play Raubans and Minwoos and units however you like. You have to be a little bit selective in terms of which are going to be relevant in the matchup. But we're running free deleter R, so in general, like, you'll be able to play Rauban pretty, like, you don't have to be too picky when you play Rauban, because you play Rauban, you play a deleter down, and deleter is huge if you have Ophelia out. 10,000 power forward, and you clear out a Rauban, so it's actually like pretty good. Pro tip about this deck is that a big part of it is psychological. So, they're like, after your opponent has lost combat to you a couple of times, your opponent's going to play very, very much more defensively. So, for example, there are times where forwards are equal in power, and you attack with your forward, like let's say you attack with Steiner, who's an 8,000 power forward if you have Ophelia out. If you attack with Steiner, and your opponent doesn't block with their 8,000 power forward, or doesn't block with, say, their 9,000 power forward, it means they're afraid. They think that you can combat trick them. And if that's the case, even if it's not the case where you may not have a combat trick, even though in most cases you will, it means that your opponent's afraid of you, which means you can attack with your smaller guys. If you attack through with the Steiner and your opponent's got a bigger guy and they don't block, then that means you can attack him with the Zidane, attack him with the Garnets, attack him with the guys. You can just attack through with smaller guys because your opponent is afraid of you. And that's a big part of this deck. It's about putting your opponent under constant fear. Putting your opponent under constant fear of trying to block you, because they're not sure if they block you whether it's going to blow up in their face or not. And like I said, if your opponent loses the combat, that's a huge swing for you. That's a big bonus for you. Also, just sort of talking more about the sort of tech cards. A lot of your cards can have multiple uses, and a lot of the flexibility of this deck comes from your forward line. So Ashe has so many uses against so many different matchups. So against Ice and Lightning, being able to reactivate her is fantastic. Just means that you're able to hold a defense when your opponent's playing Genesis or Amon. But also, she's also resistant against ping effects. So depending on the situation, you can play her in a varied amount of situations, and she's going to be good. Zidane is probably another great example for this. Typically, the way I play Zidane, I'll play him and I'll draw a card in about half the circumstances. If you still got low amount of backups, if you have 2 to 3 backups, in general, it's better to draw with him because you want to set up. You want to have more options and you want to have more backups. You want to get to around 3 or 4 backups, and Zidane will help give you the cards that you need to do that. If you have control of the boards, let's say you have 2 to 3 guys, which you'll have because you'll be playing either Steiner or Brandelis early, and you'll be playing guys early, and if your opponent is a more control or slow deck, they're trying to set up. They're trying to get their backups down. They're trying to put up some sort of defense. In that sort of situation, I will generally use the Zidane to make your opponent discard a card because you want to set them back even further. You want to tighten the resources they have to sort of counter your stronger board presence. Even in a situation where you might want to draw a card, forcing your opponent to discard a card when you're ahead means that it makes it much more difficult for them to respond to you. On a very rare occasion, and this is probably what really sort of sets the good players from the great players, is to use the third Zidane ability, which reactivates all your FF9 characters. So, the best way I can sort of describe this is when the game sort of becomes deadlocked, in the sense that, let's say if you and your opponent both have, say, 3 to 4 forwards, and they're both about equally sized, as they're between 7 to 9,000 power forwards. In that situation, it's very difficult for either player to sort of push through. So let's say if you attack with your biggest guy, they might let it through, but then all of a sudden, after you attack with your biggest guy, it means that he's not available to defend, so then your opponent is able to turn around and attack through with 3 or 4 of their guys, and it's going to leak through a lot of damage. And both players are usually around sort of mid damage, or around 3 or 4 damage, so the field becomes quite deadlocked in that sort of situation. Even if you sort of play a Giphole and make your guys too big to block, you generally don't have lethal because you'll maybe be able to have 4 guys that are going to be bigger than his guys. He might let through, say, 3 damage, and then all he has to do is block the last one, and then your entire board is open for him to come back at you. So in such a situation, this is where Zidane really sort of comes in. In a lot of these situations, when you're attacking with your guys and your opponent in general, instead of trying to risk combat, they will just leak through the damage. They'll let 2, maybe 3 guys through, because as soon as you let your guys through, they're dull, and then they'll be able to attack you back and be able to capitalize on that. So in that sort of situation, you declare your attack with your 9s. Your opponent will generally hesitate and then let them through. They'll probably get up to 5 damage, and then you play Zidane in your main phase 2 to reactivate your 9s. That's really sort of the big handy thing about Zidane, is that in those situations where you're deadlocked and you're trying to get through damage, or you can't deal enough damage to force your opponent to block, and your opponent can let enough damage through to not die, Zidane will help you shift the balance of power. They'll let you attack through a certain amount of your forwards, because they think that they're going to be it's going to be safe for them to attack you back. You play Zidane, reactivate all your 9s, and then you're ready to block, and you've gained damage. Then next turn, if you want to follow up with a Gippo, or follow up with Zodiac or something, you've got that ability to do so. But he's just kind of a sneaky way to really sort of edge out the extra little bit of damage as well. So yeah. Not to mention, it's always just handy against ice. If your opponent's got like a whole bunch of his stuff frozen down, just play Zidane, reactivate your guys, and it's fine. You know, like, if you need to block, and you need to if you need to put up a defense, and you don't have an Ashe, or if you don't have an Ashe or a guy available, play Zidane, reactivate your guys, and that way they can hold a defense. So Zidane is definitely one of those cards that an average player and a really good player will really be able to differentiate when to use those abilities. Next card, okay, and so this is probably an equally difficult card to sort of like really get right, is when to play Deleter and which Deleter to play. So Deleter Legend is good at two particular situations of the game. So he's good early game and he's good late game. In the mid game, his ability isn't super relevant. So in the early game, you can use him as a defense against ultra aggressive decks. So examples include like X-Def Mannequins or Yang Ursula, or say Vincent Yuffie, or like just any sort of like ice sort of forward such as Kuja or Snow. He is a very safe forward to play in that situation, because if your opponent wants to get around him, they're going to lose their forwards. Like, Snow can't get around Deleter. If Deleter L is your only forward on the field, Snow can't get through him because he attacks. He has to dull an opposing forward, and if Deleter's the only one, then Snow dies. Even if your Deleter is dull already, Snow has to target him. So in that way, if you don't have like a good option to deal with your opponent, or to like be able to stop your opponents from attacking you because maybe you don't draw a Brandless, or maybe you don't draw a Steiner, then you can just use your one backup, discard 2 cards, put a Deleter down, and give you some breathing room, give you some time. Deleter will be able to block a lot of stuff. That being said, he also just like forces very bad trades to your opponents. If your opponent really wants to get around him with say Alcid combo, then they have to waste the entire Alcid combo to deal with him. Not to mention, if your opponent wants to play stuff like Armon or Genesis, things that have a compulsory effect when they come into play, he will stop your opponent from playing them. So he is unbelievably good early game to just stop cards with compulsory effects. Other cards include the free cost Fire Mannequin, Imaginary Brawler, because when she attacks, she has to make the opposing biggest forward unblockable. She dies instantly. Genesis, Cease, Emperor's Hand, these are all things that whenever they attack, they have to like trigger off that effect, have to choose opponent's forward, and then the guy dies. So Deleter L is a very good blocker early game when you need to buy yourself time, because it forces your opponent to really sacrifice a lot in order to get over him. Secondly, Deleter L really shines in the late game, especially when your opponent is at 6 life. When your opponent's at 6 life, Deleter basically becomes immune to targeting summons. Basically, because if he is chosen by a summon, your opponent loses a game. So he fundamentally becomes immune to those sort of abilities. In a situation where I'm just sort of like pushing my opponent for damage, as soon as you get to that magic number 6, then you put the Deleter down. It's very difficult for your opponent to deal with him. Especially like, for example, like water decks that like run Sildres and Leviathans. They might just say, alright, go down Leviathan or Sildre your guys, and then swing in for 4 guys and win the game. If you put the Deleter down, they cannot bounce your Deleter L using summons ever again, because they're going to lose. Comparatively, Deleter R is the one that you'll be playing most around the mid game. Mainly because you'll usually have Rabans out, so you generally you'll play a Raban in the sort of early game to sort of get some board advantage, and you're going to want to clear it out so you can play a second Raban a little bit later. With Ophelia out, he's a constant 10k forward, so that's a huge forward, and he only costs 3. And blowing up one of your own backups isn't an issue at all. Basically, you're going to want to clear space for your backups. It's not even a drawback at all in a lot of cases. And for 10k, he's absolutely fantastic. His S ability is actually his S ability is actually stupidly strong as well. In any sort of against decks that are able to put up able to put up really strong forwards on defense, then Delita's R ability is actually really good. Also, any sort of decks that have combat tricks as well. So, like, let's say if you're dealing with a lightning deck and they have a Gilgamesh out, Gilgamesh is really difficult to deal with because he can't be bounced. So, like, bounce effects don't affect him. He's also able to naturally pump himself, and also lightning also has Cyclops as a combat trick. So, if you have Delita R out and you have a Delita in hand, then you can attack without any sort of hesitation. Let's say you attack with Delita R and your opponent casts, say, Cyclops. Blocks with a guy and casts Cyclops. You just say, nope, okay, I'm going to lose combat, but I'm just going to use S ability, discard a Delita, and break your blocking forward. All of a sudden, you get out clean. And your opponent's wasted resources trying to force you to do that. So yeah, his S ability is really good. Highly underrated. And the fact that we have two very good Delitas means that in certain matchups where we don't need the extra Delita Ls, we can just pitch them for his S ability, which is very strong. He's another good card that this card deals with is Prish, the 5-cost Prish. So the 4-cost Prish we can deal with because we have Una H, but the 5-cost Prish is a little bit more difficult to deal with because on defense he's actually really strong. So if you don't have a Raban or Atomos to deal with 5-cost Prish, then you just attack with Delita and he can't and Prish can't block it. Basically, if Prish blocks it, she'll die instantly. So he's another good way to just force your opponent to either block and lose his guys, or just let you get through damage. And that's what the big core of this deck is all about. It's about attacking through, forcing your opponent to be in a lose-lose situation, getting damage through, and as soon as your opponent's low on damage, you just finish them off with one of your big cards. So yeah. So, more stuff. Okay. So this deck does have a bit of a hard matchup against certain Earth decks that play the Dark Knights. So this deck tends to get a lot of early damage down, so it's pretty easy for you to get an early 3 or 4 damage down. Against Earth decks though, the Earth decks that play like the Dark Knights, that is going to be what's going to be kind of difficult, because all of a sudden in one turn they're going to like spam out Dark Knight, Gabranth, and all of a sudden you're dealing with like 10k, 11k, 11k. And the guy's going to be really big. This is the sort of situation where Zodiac is handy, because in those sort of situations, your opponent doesn't have very good combat tricks to respond to you, but they're able to play guys that are bigger than you, so it makes it very difficult for you to leak through damage. This is exactly the sort of situation that you want to use Zodiac in. Your opponents like put their last chips down onto these big guys and hoping they can buy time. If you cast Zodiac, you clear them out, you take some damage, you'll generally be head-on damage for like 90% of games. And then you just like go in for lethal. So Zodiac is a tool to help you win control matchups. So this is typically more relevant for Earth and occasionally for Lightning, simply because Armon's a little bit annoying. So if you don't have a way to deal with Armon, then it's possible for Lightning to sort of brick wall you. This is just going to wipe the entire board and allow you to force yourself through. Another little thing. Generally, against any matchup where you can, in any matchup where the opposing deck has a board clear, such as Shantoto, Zalera the Death Seraph, or Exodus, you want to have more than 3 guys at a time. If you're ever in a situation where you have more than 3 guys at a time, do not commit any more dudes to a board, because it just sets you up for a very big loss when your opponent uses the board wipe on you. Just accumulate the resource in hand, spend some time putting some backups down. So that's pretty much the general instructions for the deck, and sort of like little notes and tidbits here and there. Next we'll talk a little bit about some of the red flags and matchups. So some of the easier matchups, in my opinion, for this deck is fire, wind, and water to some extent. I'm not sure about the water's alright. But yeah, fire is probably the easiest matchup, simply because with Mimu and Una H, the game is locked down. The game is just locked down. Your opponents, a lot of their tools are taken out of the game. In addition, Delita L is unbelievably good. Like, there's tons of compulsory like effects on fire cards that if you just sit a Delita L down, it just makes it very difficult to deal with. Your opponent, if they want to use, say, Red Mage on Delita, breaking the Red Mage is extremely good. It's unbelievably good. Also, Seguarides, not Seguarides, Pelennor, who removes First Strike, also is handy against Belias. Not to mention Cecil R can also draw it as well. So fire is actually a really easy matchup to deal with. Cecil R also is handy against unblockable type abilities. So if your opponent has red mages, your opponent can only just red mage a Cecil. So basically, they can just make your Cecil unable to block, but then all your other guys can block. So so this match is unbelievably easy for you to win. Just set up, you win fights. You basically remove all their threats, and then you just kind of win. Another easy matchup is Wind. Probably the reason why Wind is kind of easy to deal with is simply because Wind doesn't have particularly strong guys. Like, their powers aren't particularly strong, and their ability to combat buff you isn't as good as your combat buffs. So usually for most Wind decks, they'll be sitting around the 7 or 8k mark. So your guys will usually be sitting around the 8, 9, 10k mark. Usually the biggest threat that Wind has is Barts, and that's basically it though. Most of the guys would be, say, like Balthier or like Pain. So they're usually around sitting around the 7 or 8k mark. You'll be able to outfight them. A big handy thing to have in this matchup is Mimwu. Being able to make your guys not be able to chip down is actually really handy. It's good against stuff like Valifor, Y'shtola, Balthiers. Basically, preventing you guys from being chipped down is actually very good. So Mimwu is definitely a big plus in this matchup. A bit of an asterisk for Wind matchups though. So a lot of Wind decks run archers, and if your opponent is smart, they will use their archers to break your Ophelias or your Pelinors or your Segurides. So with your 2-cost backups, don't discard extra copies too soon against Wind matchups. At some point, your opponent is going to break your Ophelias. You got to get the second one down, and so don't be tempted to just go, oh, I discard Ophelia, put an Ophelia down. Discard a different water card, put the Ophelia down, and hold the extra Ophelia. Because at some point, your opponent's going to want to archer it, and that's when you chuck the second one down. It's way more important for you to keep that extra copy in hand and put it down after they archer you. Because archering stuff is kind of expensive, because they have to spend 2 Wind and break their backup. It's kind of expensive. So if you can put down a replacement really quickly after they archer you, that's going to really solidify the matchup. And finally, Water is pretty strong in the metagame at the moment, but I feel in this matchup it's actually it's not too hard for us to deal with, mainly because Water has a lot of bounce abilities, and bouncing most of you guys is actually pretty bad. So bouncing Steiner, Zidane, Garnet, Bradless, it's all kind of pretty bad because they all have like come into play abilities that have effects. So most of your core guys are just like bouncing them is going to be pretty irrelevant. Ashe is actually like resistant against Choo Choo Lane. If your opponent tries to use Choo Choo Lane to deal with her, then Ashe will like get a buff. The biggest card that's going to help you out in this matchup is Garnet, simply because the water summon is actually really quite strong, and Garnet is one of your best defensive walls against water. Your opponent cannot use Sildra or Leviathan to bounce your Garnet, so if you have a Garnet and she's active and you have a Golem in hand, your opponent's not going to be able to get through. Especially if you have a Mimwu out and you can just sequentially block every guy. In a situation where you're afraid that your opponent might just like bounce you guys and rush in with like 4 guys, always keep your Garnet active and keep her ready there. Because your opponent will have to use like Mog 9, or like Una H to bounce her, and those are very sort of niche cards in water decks. Against water, just play aggressively. It takes them a longer time to set up, and in general, you'll be able to force them out of the game pretty quickly. So matchups that are sort of even matchups, we probably Lightning is an even, if not slightly, you have a slightly favorable advantage. And the main reason is because we have a lot of cards that deal that answer their things. So Ashe and Mimwu are going to be your biggest cards against the Lightning matchup, simply because they deal with the dreaded Alcid combo, prevent you guys from being pinged, and Ashe is resistant to like everything in Lightning except for Odin. So they're really strong. Deleter L is actually really good as well. Something that's actually pretty fun to do. I actually did this quite a few times in my regionals runs. Is if you put Deleter down and you have Ophelia out, your Deleter's at 10,000 power. Sometimes your opponent might think, screw it, let's deal with the Deleter, and they'll play Alcid Onion Knight to try to kill your Deleter, and are okay with their combo dying. In which case, all it takes is just a 1-cost golem to get your 10,000 power Deleter up to 12,000, and you've wiped out 8 CP worth of value. You've wiped out the Alcid, you wiped out the Onion Knight, and you wiped out the 4 CP that they spent to play it. So it's just the best feeling when your opponent commits a huge amount to try to deal with your Deleter, and you just play 1 CP to just stop it. and then your opponent has to like waste more resources trying to deal with it. So that's absolutely fun. A big thing to note is that against lightning, they do have Cyclops as a combat trick. So Cyclops is a pretty relevant combat trick. Any sort of situation where you are sort of like very close to your opponent in terms of power, or if you're slightly like ahead of your opponent in power, you almost always want to hold Atomos in hand. Simply because when your opponent plays Cyclops, you want to respond with it with Atomos to just win the fight. So a good example is, let's say if I'm attacking my opponent with, say, a 10,000 deleter and my opponent has a Gilgamesh, right? So I'll attack with deleter, the opponent blocks with Gilgamesh, then they play Cyclops, reduces my deleter down to 7,000 power. Before the Cyclops resolves, if you cast Atomos, you can deal 10,000 damage to their Gilgamesh before the Cyclops resolves. So before your guy gets a debuff, you can use it to kill or lethal out their forward. In that situation, it's actually really, really good. There was one of my mates who I played in regionals who won one of the regionals, who plays Earth Lightning. Any sort of situation where if you have a Atomos to counter their Cyclops, you'll almost always you'll pretty much win the game there, simply because it's such a huge swing. If your opponent, especially if your opponent doesn't have the extra backup, if your opponent starts discarding 2 cards of Cyclops and you're Atomosing their forward, they'll lose the forward, they'll lose the Cyclops and 2 cards that they spent for it, and your forward's still fine. Your opponent has been set back a huge amount of resources. Usually if it's against like Gilgamesh as well, it's absolutely strong. So you've broken your opponent's Gilgameshes. They spent 4 CP to put the Gilgamesh down. They spent effectively 4 CP to get the Cyclops, and they spent the Cyclops, and you countered it all with Atomos. So against lightning, always hold the Atomos in hand, because at some point they're going to Cyclops you. In response to Cyclops, blow up their guy. And so against lightning, also another thing that's relevant to note is Armon is unbelievably annoying. Armon is unbelievably annoying. Kill that piece of crap every time with Raubon. Like, just hold Raubon every single time, and as soon as you see the Armon, you just, alright, cool, whatever, play a bigger guy, use Raubon, kill him every single time. He's so unbelievably annoying. He's basically one of the few ways that Lightning's going to be able to brick wall you. So clear Armons every single time. Clear them all out. Because otherwise the Armons are just going to like sit back and just keep dulling your Brandellises, or keep dulling your other attackers. And it's really annoying because you don't really want to commit too many boards to commit too many guys to the field. And he's just going to be able to hold off a lot. So get rid of Armon every single time. And also, one final thing is never play more than 2. Like, in general, if you can help it, never play more than 2 guys at the same cost. More than 2 guys at the same cost, in the sense that Exodus is able to, Exodus is a 4-cost spell from Lightning that's where both players choose a cost and destroys all forwards of those costs. So most of you guys are either, for this deck, most of you guys are either 3 cost or 5 cost. So it's an extremely bad feeling when your opponent's able to clear out your Zidane, your Garnet, and your Ash at the same time. Or Zidane, Garnet, Ash, Deleter, because they're all 3 costs. So wiping all of them out with the same spell actually feels terrible. It feels probably worse if you lose a Brandellis, a Steiner, and a Deleter L at the same time. So make sure the cost of the cards that you play against Lightning are varied. Make sure you have a couple of 3s and a couple of 5s. So this is a big weakness. Make sure you don't get baited into it. The other matchup that's probably even matchup is Earth matchup. So first and foremost, against Earth, never go more than 3 guys, okay? Never ever go more than 3 guys. Unless your opponent's building up a big board where they have say 3 or 4 guys, never go more than 3 forwards, because you are just waiting to get Shantoted. You're waiting to get Shantoted. The different sort of Earth matchups will sort of vary. There's quite a few different Earth decks at the moment, and they're all pretty strong. So there's the Yang Ursula build, then there's the Vincent Yuffie build, and then there's the Prish Scarmiglio and Zombie Tactics build. So let's talk about the Yang Ursula, Vincent Yuffie, because they're very similar decks. So in both those situations, you try to contest the board, because usually they will play Yang or Vincent very early. They'll discard 2 cards, get the Yang or the Vincent down, and then get their buddy in for basically for free. In both these cases, you just gotta play some guys down and then have a golem ready. You generally need to play 2 guys down, because let's say if you play one guy, let's say if you just play Zidane, right? Then usually your opponent will prevent you from using any sort of combat tricks because they'll follow up with a Raban. So they'll Raban and then hit you for another 2. So that's why against Earth, and whenever they have an explosive style like that, you have to get 2 guys down ASAP. Okay, usually it's going to be Steiner and a Zidane. You get 2 guys down, your opponent will be able to kill one of your guys with Raban or something per se, and then you just block the other one, and then you golem it. That's how you do it. So all you have to do is just stop that first big offense, and then like just build up from there. Yeah, that's how you sort of win those sort of matchups. Do note that on a side note, Choo Lane can be used to soft counter Raban. So if your opponent's playing a Raban, which will happen pretty early if they're playing Earth, you can counter it with Choo Lane because they put the Raban in. Usually they'll be like tapping 1 or 2 backups, and then the Choo Lane comes in. So usually they'll have at least 3 double backups, right? And then if you use Choo Lane on the forward that they chose, you can get minus 3,000 power. Yeah, it means that their guy becomes smaller, your guy doesn't die, and also as a side advantage, it prevents their guy from attacking, because if their guy is all of a sudden smaller than your guy, even though your guy took Raban damage, your guy can still block their guy and at least trade combat. So Choo Lane is very relevant in Earth matchups. Against the Prish, Scarmiglio, and Zombie Tactics deck, Una H is your best friend here. There have been so many times where I've just caught people off guard, because I might have 2 or 3 guys that are around 7,000, 8,000 power. I might have like Garnet, Zidane, and Steiner, which happens very frequently for the deck. And your opponent thinks, all right, gotta discard 2 cards, tap 2 backups, put a Prish down, and block. They probably have like a Prish in hand. On your turn, you just tap 3 backups, put down the Una H, bounce that thing back up, and then you rush them with 3 guys. That's exactly what you do every single time. Your opponent is just, like basically, when your opponent plays Prish, your opponent's putting a lot of resources into it. You deal with it the first time very easily, and then from there on out, Prish just becomes irrelevant. From there on out, you can just like fight it with like deleters, because your deleters will be bigger than a Prish 6 cost Prish legend, and you'll move from the game, so they can't get the level 5 Prishes. Level 5 Prish or 5 cost Prish are actually probably the harder one to deal with, in the sense that it's very difficult for you to get over a 12,000 power blocker. Plus, like in any situation where you're like, well, maybe if I golem enough, or if I use like Choo Lane enough, then maybe I might be able to get over the 12,000 power. But you always risk your opponent using Aurora Uppercut, which will just like completely win that defensive fight. Like, there's no way that you can have enough combat pumps for you to deal with a 24,000 power Prish. That Aurora Uppercut will just wreck you. But what you do, you save Rabans and Atomos. Basically, outside of combat, she's only 8,000 power, 9,000 if they have N across. You just save your Rabans and the Atomos and just break her out of combat, and then you attack. Also, like another side little benefit is Deleter R. You just attack with him. You attack with him, they'll block, and then you just use Deleter R's like Northshire Swag. No, Northshire Hit. No, Northshire Strike. Yeah, Northshire Strike to break him. So you've got options to deal with it, but they're very like specific options to deal with it. But Zombie Tactics is easy for you to deal with. On another side note, and this is where this card really shines. Cecil R is the best card in this matchup. It locks out your opponent's golems and monks. So the thing is that Earth has the best combat tricks in the game, especially defensive combat tricks. You might be able to use Choo Lane to give your opponent like -2, -3, but if your opponent's blocking, they will always be able to reserve the ability to just pay 1 and golem for +4, and you'll probably lose a fight. So in any sort of situation where you feel that your opponent can like combat your offense with like a golem, you just pay 5, put Cecil down, and all of a sudden it locks out your opponent's monks, locks out your opponent's golems. And most Earth decks are running monks. So as soon as Cecil is down, their monks become useless, because their monks have to go onto Cecil. You can't use them defensively. In high level play, if your opponent uses a monk, they're forced to put it onto Cecil. They can't put it on their own guys. So extremely good. Also, as a little side benefit, Cecil R can force bad death penalties. So there might be situations where your opponent's Vincent might want to death penalty your Zidane and your Garnet. That's not a bad trade. Spending 5, using Vincent to clear out a Zidane and a Garnet is actually like not bad. But as soon as you put the Cecil R down, all of a sudden he is unable to do that. So your opponent is forced to death penalty you on their turn. Because if you have the Cecil R, all you have to do is put him down. Your opponent can't respond to his field effect. So you put the Cecil R down, and your opponent like can't death penalty you guys. He has to spend 5 to death penalty your Cecil, which isn't even like a good trade off for him. Um, so yeah, so yeah, like Cecil R is unbelievably good in this matchup. If you can keep him alive, he'll just straight up win your Earth matchup most of the time. And now to the hard matchups. So the hardest matchup for you is Ice. And there's for a couple of reasons. So first of all, Vayne is unbelievably good in this matchup. He will lock down so many guys. He locks down your Steiners, he locks down your Brandelis, he locks down your Deleter L. So those are your three big knights that he locks out of the game, or he like keeps them dull. Obviously, against Ice, you want to always keep Atomos and Rabans active to deal with Vayne. To deal with Vayne every single time. This is why this deck also runs 2 Ash and 2 Guy, because while you are waiting to get your removal to remove Vayne, you're going to need some ways to block and to basically prevent damage. And this is where Guy and Ash will sort of like really save you in a lot of situations. Don't be tempted to attack with Guy, even though he's brave, in the sense that if your opponent does have a Mateus in hand, that's one of the few ways that Ice can deal with Guy. So until you have board control, do not attack with Guy, because he will die to Mateus. Even if you even if your opponent has to discard 3 cards from Mateus, as soon as they get rid of their Guy, the rest of their guys are just gonna rush in and flood you. So do not attack with Guy unless you have good field control. That's 100% the case. Also, the second reason why Ice is so strong is again, it's a very similar reason why Lightning has a decent matchup. Is the new Ice summon Zillera, the Death Seraph. So it breaks all opposing forwards that cost 2, 3, 5, 7, 10, 11, etc., etc. So basically, the big numbers that it hits is that it hits 3 costs and 5 costs. So for a lot of other decks, 4 costs and 6 costs are where they're really at. So yeah, so it's not a particularly good card in against Lightning, for example. But against us, the fact that it hits all dull 3s and all dull 5s is actually unbelievably painful. So again, very similar to the Lightning matchup. Do not play more than 2 guys of these costs. In general, you're not going to be playing more than say 2 5 costs, because you're just setting yourself up for bad veins. But yeah, just try to have it even out in terms of 3s and 5s, you know. For example, you might have a Steiner, a Garnet, and a Zidane. You know, that's not too bad if that happens. But yeah, you have to be very careful. Have to be very careful. Also, something to note about this matchup is that you have actually two Brave attackers in this deck, in the sense that Brandelis will have Brave and Guy has Brave. In terms of your attack declarations, always attack with the Brave ones first, because the one common thread amongst 99% of Ice decks is that they're running 3 Junabas, and I hate that trick so much. Okay, so if you think about it, if you've got 3 attackers, 1 has Brave and 2 of them don't have Brave, right? If you attack with the non-Brave guys first, so it's non-Brave guy, your opponent might have a chance to EX burst your Junabat, right? If you attack with the second guy, there's another instance where they might flip over Junabat to freeze these 2 guys. And then the third guy attacks and he's Brave, then your opponent... So the first guy has 3 damage opportunities to get Junabated, the second one has 2 opportunities to get Junabated, and the Brave guy doesn't really matter, right? So that's why you always attack with the Brave guy first. You attack with the Brave guy first, so if you do flip a Junabat, then it's not going to affect him. You attack with the second guy, and then if the Junabat flips, it's only really going to affect that guy, and then the last guy attacks, and yeah, if they flip a Junabat, then they flip a Junabat then. But basically, you attack with the Brave guy first, because if they do flip over a Junabat, it means that the one that's most vulnerable to Junabat, or the most chances of your opponent Junabating, is the Brave guy, which it doesn't affect. So that's just kind of interesting little note to deal with that matchup. But yeah, so moving on, the pros and cons of the deck. So the main pro of the deck is that it is very, very consistent. There is a lot of search and a lot of cycle in this deck, and it's the reason why I was sort of drawn to this deck to begin with was the fact that I was experimenting with Earth decks, and I just didn't like how you had to rely on whatever cards you drew to sort of play. I really wanted to sort of have a very consistent game plan every game to play out, and I just like having a ton of cards to sort of search out the parts that I need every single time. It's very strong combat wise. Against most sort of mid-range decks, you just outfight people. Against a lot of aggressive early decks, you'll be able to deal with them if you have your golems and your choo-choos in hand. Yeah. Another benefit is that like the deck has a lot of EX bursts. In this build, I think it's got 18 EX bursts, and a lot of them are very relevant all the time. The most relevant one is just Raoban. Just Raoban is unbelievably good as an EX burst. Occasionally, like even Gipol and Golems are good in terms of EX burst, because let's say if your opponent attacks you, and let's say if your opponent's got like say 2 big guys and they attack you the first one, if you don't block and you take the damage, you might flip over a Gipol or a Golem. All of a sudden, your remaining guys are big enough to block their secondary attackers. So it's good in that it just basically forces your opponent to stop attacking. So you get a lot of EX bursts. 18 out of 50, that's almost like 40%. So you'll be hitting EX bursts quite a lot, and most of them most of your EX bursts are very good. If you hit Steiners or Brandelis, that just gets you an extra card. Raoban pretty much kills a dude. Golems or Gipols basically just like force your opponent to stop attacking. So most of your EX bursts are very good. So taking damage early on is actually like not too bad. So also as a final little pro is that the deck has a lot of deck shuffling. So it's one of those few decks where you don't feel bad if there's a key card that you need that's relevant early and you have to Mulligan the hand. You don't feel bad for it because they're not going to stay at the bottom of your deck forever. You're going to be able to shuffle your deck by around turn 2, turn 3. So you'll be able to like sort of get them back into the mix like pretty soon. So that's another just kind of little key bonus to it. The cons of this deck, what are weaknesses to it, is that this deck needs to deal with any sort of defensive like walls very quickly. The deck burns through its like deck really quickly. You run out of cards very quickly. In any sort of situation where the game sort of drags on, which realistically it's not going to drag on too often, but any sort of situation where your opponent is able to really sort of like brick wall you, then you will just you'll almost always lose because your deck is always going to be lower because you've like drawn more from it. So like one of the few regions that I did play, I found out this weakness against a mill deck. You just like run through cards really quickly. Typically Earth is the only color that's able to brick wall you. But now that we've got like Zodiacs and we've got stuff like Gipol, we'll be able to run through it. But like that's something you do need to consider, that you have to be aggressive. You have to try to force your opponent to get to lower life. Because if the opponent successfully brick walls you, then you're going to lose on deck out. Also, just kind of another little con. This deck is actually you have to exercise a lot of caution when you're playing this deck. You have to exercise a lot of caution. It's very easy for your entire board to get blown up by the board wipes that like Earth or Lightning or Ice all have. So that's why they're your more difficult matchups, because they are able to like sort of have one card that deals with a lot of part of your board. So you have to play cautiously. There will be times where your opponent just does it and they're able to kill two of you guys. Ideally, you don't want to be in a situation where they can kill 3 of you guys. But if your opponent has to like force killing 2 of you guys, then that's fine. You just reset and you continue like fighting on against your opponent. So so next thing is meta decisions. So a couple of things. If your local metagame has a lot of ice in it, then I would exchange one of your deleter R's for another guy, so go up to 3 guy. And also switch a Mimu and a Scholar for 2 Astrologians. Astrologians, just kind of handy against ice. It gives you another way to reactivate your guys. Mimu's not too relevant if the field's like very ice heavy. If you have a lot of aggressive decks in your metagame, or a lot of decks where they sort of come out with a lot of big guys, or they swarm you very very early, I would switch a Cecil R, an Ash, a deleter R. Switch out all your Cecil R, switch out your Ashes, and switch out a deleter R for 3 copies of the new Scarmiglione and 2 copies of the Opus 2 Scarmiglione. Scarmiglione is a fantastic card. I did play it in one of the earlier builds of the deck. I took it out because it kind of doesn't have enough offensive power, but against aggressive decks, it's a very good brick wall. And it's going to buy you a lot of time. And also, switch out your copy of Zodiac for a second Shantoto. So that if the field is feeling aggressive, make those switches. So final tips. Just because the deck is aggressive doesn't mean you want to discard a lot of cards. Generally, you'll be like, that first 5 cost that you play, that first Steiner or that first Brandelis, is pretty much the only time you want to be discarding 2 cards for forward. And the reason why we do that is because it's going to search you for the next piece of your deck, and then it moves you forward from there. From there on out, we want to try to keep your discards very minimal, to maybe one card at most. Get up to 3 backups, and yeah. So that first card is going to be a big investment. You get that down, you get more backups down, and then all of a sudden you get up to 3 backups. That's where you sort of really will be cruising. But yeah, generally try to avoid discarding cards regularly. You have to get those backups down. Not only do they help your offense, but they also help your resources, because a lot of your stuff is high costed, even though you do get the resources back. So yeah, another little tip is, unless you're getting rushed, so unless your opponent has put in a big field commitment that you have to deal with, generally it's better to wait the turn and play Zidane using backups. A lot of people will play Steiner, search for Zidane, then discard a card for Zidane, draw a card. When you play it like that, you're basically cycling a card for Zidane. But personally, I think it's way better, if you're not under pressure from board, to just wait till next turn, tap 2 backups, put a Zidane in, you're drawing yourself an extra card. So then you can use that resource to sort of play more stuff and sort of build up. So yeah, so generally, unless you're being aggressed on, you don't need to play it super aggressive. Your deck will just in general be pressuring your opponent, but you don't have to overcommit to being overly aggressive in order to do that. Yeah, and also just don't forget that your 2 night backups are just going to be relevant in a lot of situations. Yeah, anytime when you're just 1,000 off, always keep in mind that you can just spread 1k to all your opponent's guys and clear them all out. So that's something that you always should keep in mind. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So just to summarize up, overall statistics of the deck. In terms of power, I rate this deck around a 7.5 out of 10. So its power is not as high as some of the other decks, such as say Lightning or say Earth. But yeah, it makes up for it with its consistency. In terms of speed, this deck is more of a mid-range deck. If anything, I would maybe err more towards mid-range to early. But yeah, it's more of a mid-range deck. In terms of consistency, this deck is a 9 out of 10. It's unbelievably consistent. You have so much search. You have so many EX bursts. You're going to be able to build up your board very consistently in most games. In terms of difficulty of playing, I think it's a 3.5. I think it's a 3.5 out of 5, or probably a 7 out of 10. It isn't a super easy deck to play, but after you sort of get a better feel for how to treat combat, then this deck will be actually really fun to play. It's definitely more of a thinking man's deck. There's a lot of little bits and pieces. All your cards aren't standalone great. They come together, and that's what you really sort of have to do in order to play this deck well. You have to have a bigger picture or a bigger plan to how you're going to handle the game. That's what makes this deck a little bit more difficult to play. So yeah. So after 90 minutes, that's our deck workshop for the Water Earth Knights deck, version 4.0, the Holy Grail. Yeah, thanks a lot for you guys for sticking around for so long. Yeah, I don't know, from the feedback from previous video, people really enjoyed the fact that it's a very comprehensive and sort of really fleshed out sort of video. So yeah, I'll try to keep the next one a little bit shorter, but there was just so much stuff to talk about for this deck. There's a lot of bits and pieces. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching, guys. And yeah, again, please feel free to give me any sort of feedback. Let me know what I can improve on, and yeah, what you're sort of looking for. So yeah, until next time, Brand J out.